At 23:45 on October 24, 1944, Commander Richard O'Kane stood on the bridge of the submarine USS Tang in the dark waters of the Taiwan Strait. The sea was black and calm, broken only by the faint shapes of ships ahead. Beside him, the radar operator quietly tracked a convoy moving across the screen. Range, 1,500 yards. Targets, 7 transports, 3 tankers, 5 destroyer escorts. They were carrying supplies toward Japanese forces fighting desperately to hold the Philippines. For O'Kane, it looked like the perfect ending to a perfect patrol. He was 33 years old, 5 war patrols completed, and already responsible for the destruction of 33 enemy ships, more than any other submarine commander in the United States Navy. If tonight ended the way the previous attacks had, he would return to Pearl Harbor a legend. Promotion would follow. Medals. Ceremonies. The story of the war's most successful submarine commander. But the weapon he was using that night carried a flaw that could kill him. The Mark 18 electric torpedo had transformed submarine warfare when it entered service in 1943. Earlier torpedoes, like the steam-powered Mark 14, left a trail of bubbles on the surface. That trail pointed directly back to the submarine that fired it. Japanese escorts could follow it like a road. The Mark 18 changed everything. It ran on electricity. No exhaust. No bubbles. No wake. From the surface, it was invisible. Japanese lookouts could not see it coming. Destroyer escorts could not trace it back to the attacker. American submarines could fire from closer range and remain hidden. The results were devastating. Convoys that once felt safe suddenly began exploding in the darkness. Tankers burst into flames. Freighters split apart. The Japanese merchant fleet began disappearing beneath the Pacific. But inside the torpedo's guidance system, there was a flaw. A tiny mechanical defect buried inside the gyroscope. Most of the time, the torpedo ran straight. But occasionally, very rarely, the gyroscope failed. And when it failed, the torpedo did something terrifying. It turned, curved, and began circling back toward the submarine that had fired it. The Navy called these accidents circular runs. Submariners called them boomerangs, because once the torpedo began circling, it came back. And if it reached the submarine before the crew could maneuver away, the submarine died. By late 1944, 2 American submarines had already been lost this way. One was USS Tang, destroyed months earlier when one of its own torpedoes curved back and exploded beneath the hull. Another submarine had been lost in similar circumstances. Most details were still classified. Only one man had survived. He spent the rest of the war in a Japanese prison camp. Every submarine commander in the Pacific knew the risk, but they kept using the Mark 18 because its advantages were too important. Silent, invisible, deadly. It sank enemy shipping faster than anything before it. Statistically, the chance of a circular run was less than 1%. 1 torpedo in 100. A risk commanders accepted every time they pulled the firing lever. Richard O'Kane had accepted that risk for 5 patrols. And in those patrols, he had built one of the most extraordinary combat records of the war. His submarine, USS Tang, had already sunk 116,000 tons of Japanese shipping, more than any American submarine. His tactics were aggressive, precise, and terrifyingly effective. He preferred night surface attacks. Tang would slip into the middle of convoys like a wolf entering a herd. From there, O'Kane fired torpedoes at point-blank range. Transports, tankers, escorts, sometimes from both sides at once. Then Tang would disappear into the darkness at full speed before the Japanese escorts understood what had happened. During Tang's 3rd patrol, O'Kane sank 10 ships in a single mission, the most successful submarine patrol of the war. His crew trusted him completely. Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Submarine Force, called O'Kane the finest submarine skipper in the fleet. And tonight, Tang had delivered its most devastating attack yet. In the past 2 days alone, the submarine had destroyed 13 ships, 7 of them tonight. 2 Japanese tankers were already burning. 3 transports were sinking. Another transport lay dead in the water. A destroyer escort had been blown apart less than 1,000 yards away. Tang had fired 22 torpedoes, and almost everyone had hit. Now only 2 torpedoes remained. 2. Then Tang would return to Pearl Harbor. Return with a record no submarine might ever match. Ahead of them, 1 transport was still afloat. Barely. Its hull was burning. The ship was drifting, its bow sinking slowly into the sea. But O'Kane believed in finishing every target. Submarine doctrine demanded it. A damaged ship left afloat could be towed back to port. Repaired. Returned to the war. Better to finish it now. One torpedo would do it. Then Tang would save the final torpedo for the journey home. 24 torpedoes. 24 ships destroyed. A perfect patrol. The crew moved quickly. In the forward torpedo room, sailors loaded torpedo number 23. O'Kane checked the firing solution himself. Range, 800 yards. Speed, 29 knots. Depth, 6 feet. Spread angle, 0. The target wasn't moving. It was a straight shot. Tang maneuvered quietly into position. At 23:52, the transport filled the submarine's periscope. O'Kane gave the order. Fire. The torpedo slid from tube number 3 and raced through the dark water. Inside the submarine, the crew counted the seconds. 10, 20, 30. Then, impact. The explosion tore through the transport's hull. The ship's bow lifted into the air before slowly collapsing back into the sea. Another enemy vessel destroyed. 34 ships. Only one torpedo remained. The crew loaded the final Mark 18 into tube number 4. Standard procedure followed. Battery voltage, normal. Gyroscope, spinning properly. Propeller, free. Depth setting, correct. Everything looked perfect. Everything ready. At 23:54, the final torpedo was locked in place. O'Kane watched the dying transport through binoculars. It was already sinking. But doctrine was doctrine. Leave nothing afloat. He recalculated the firing solution. The drifting ship had moved closer. Range, 500 yards. Point-blank distance. At that range, the torpedo would reach the target in 20 seconds. O'Kane nodded. Fire. At 23:55, the final torpedo left the tube. For the first 3 seconds, it ran straight. Then something strange happened. A trail of foam appeared on the surface. The torpedo broke through the water. It was running too shallow. Instead of staying at 6 feet, the Mark 18 had climbed to the surface. It began skipping across the waves. Porpoising. The gyroscope had failed. O'Kane saw it instantly. The torpedo curved. Hard left. Turning in a wide arc coming back. A circular run. The 1% malfunction. The defect that had already destroyed 2 American submarines. Now it was happening to USS Tang. Emergency speed. O'Kane shouted. The diesel engines roared. Tang lurched forward. Full right rudder. The submarine began to turn. On the bridge, the crew saw it clearly now. A white wake cutting across the Black Sea. The torpedo racing toward them. 300 yards. 200. 100. Tang's propellers dug into the water. The submarine tried to swing its stern away. But a 312-foot submarine does not turn quickly. Tang needed distance. Tang needed time. Tang had neither. The Mark 18 completed its circle in 20 seconds. Then it struck. The explosion hit the submarine's stern on the port side. 575 pounds of Torpex explosive detonated against the hull. The blast ripped through the after torpedo room. Water flooded in instantly. Then the after engine room. Then the maneuvering room. 3 compartments gone in seconds. 23 sailors trapped in the rear of the submarine died before they could even react. The explosion threw O'Kane and 8 others from the bridge into the black water of the Taiwan Strait. Behind them, the submarine's stern began to sink. USS Tang slipped beneath the wave's tail first. And inside the submarine, 60 men were still alive. But they were trapped 180 feet below the surface. And the only way out was up. Inside the forward torpedo room of USS Tang, the air was slowly killing them. 30 men were packed into the cramped compartment. Shirts were stripped off and tossed aside. The heat had become unbearable. They drank the last of the water. Every breath tasted stale. Carbon dioxide built up in the sealed space as 30 exhausted sailors fought for air that no longer seemed to exist. The atmosphere grew thicker by the minute, heavy and suffocating. Some men were already gasping. Others leaned against the steel bulkheads, trying to breathe slowly, trying to conserve what little oxygen remained. The weakest sailors were already collapsing, but they could not escape yet. Above them, somewhere on the surface of the Taiwan Strait, a Japanese destroyer escort still circled the area. Active sonar pulses echoed through the water. Every few minutes another depth charge exploded nearby. Not the heavy charges meant to destroy a submarine, These were shallow charges, harassment explosions designed to force survivors to the surface. Anyone who escaped now would be spotted instantly, captured, or machine-gunned in the water. So the crew waited. They endured the heat. They endured the smoke from the damaged battery compartment. And they waited for the destroyer to leave. Along the walls of the torpedo room were lockers containing the only equipment that might save them. Momsen Lungs. Each device looked deceptively simple. A rubberized breathing bag about the size of a small pillow. Inside the bag was a canister filled with soda lime, a chemical that removed carbon dioxide from exhaled air. 2 breathing tubes extended from the bag. 1 tube for inhaling, 1 for exhaling. The system recycled breath. The user inhaled oxygen. Exhaled air passed through the soda lime canister, which removed carbon dioxide. The cleaned air returned to the breathing bag. It was crude, but it could keep a man alive for roughly 10 minutes, just long enough to reach the surface. If everything worked perfectly, the bag also provided flotation once inflated. If the sailor reached open air, if he survived the ascent. The problem was training. Most of Tang's crew had practiced with the Momsen Lung exactly once. Submarine school. A comm training tank. 50 feet of water. Medical staff watching. Instructors standing nearby. Nothing like what they faced now. They were trapped 180 feet below the surface. In darkness. In combat. With no rescue coming. The escape procedure was complicated and unforgiving. First, sailors would enter the escape trunk, a narrow vertical chamber connecting the torpedo room to the outside ocean. The hatch behind them would be sealed. Then the chamber would slowly flood. As water filled the space, pressure would rise until it matched the pressure outside the submarine. Only then could the outer hatch be opened. The sailor would push himself into the sea. From there, the climb began. Breathing through the Momsen Lung. Ascending slowly. Exhaling constantly. Never holding his breath. Never rising too fast. If he held his breath, expanding air could rupture his lungs. If he rose too quickly, nitrogen bubbles could form in his bloodstream. The bends. Paralysis. Death. But if everything worked, he might reach the surface alive. The heat inside the torpedo room kept rising. 120 degrees. Then higher. Men collapsed one after another. Those still conscious dragged them closer to the escape trunk, trying to keep them alive, trying to keep them ready. Because once the escape began, it would not stop. Each Momsen Lung contained only a limited supply of oxygen. The first men to leave would use the freshest air. The last men would have almost nothing left. Timing was everything. At 5:30, the sonar pings finally faded. The destroyer was moving away. The depth charges stopped. No one spoke. The crew waited another 30 minutes. Listening. Praying. When no more sonar pulses returned, they began preparing the escape. Only 13 men would attempt it. The strongest. The youngest. Those with the best chance of surviving the ascent. The others were too weak. Too injured. Too unconscious. They would remain in the torpedo room and die there. At 6 o'clock, the first sailor climbed into the escape trunk. He wore the Momsen Lung around his neck. The breathing bag was inflated. The soda lime canister was fresh. He carried nothing else. No weapons. No supplies. Just the breathing bag. And hope. The hatch closed behind him. Cold seawater began flooding the chamber. The pressure climbed. 30 pounds per square inch. At 180 feet, water pressure reached nearly 80 pounds per square inch. More than 5 times the pressure at the surface. Enough to crush lungs if a man breathed wrong. Enough to kill instantly. At 6:15, the outer hatch opened. The sailor pushed himself out into the black water and began the ascent. He breathed through the Momsen Lung. Inhale. Exhale. Never stop exhaling. The rubber bag recycled his breath, removing carbon dioxide, returning oxygen, keeping him alive. The climb felt endless. 3 minutes. Maybe 4. He could see nothing. Just darkness. Pressure crushed against his chest. His ears screamed. His head pounded. Still he rose. Breathing. Exhaling. Climbing. At 6:19, he burst through the surface. Alive. The first man out. Proof that escape from 180 feet was possible. He inflated the flotation portion of the Momsen Lung and began treading water. The sea around him was empty. The convoy had vanished. Burning ships had already sunk. The horizon glowed faintly with the coming sunrise. Below him, more sailors began their ascent. The second man surfaced. Then the third. Then the fourth. The system was working. The device invented nearly 20 years earlier was saving lives. By 7 o'clock, 13 men had attempted the escape, but only 8 reached the surface alive. 5 died during the climb. One man's Momsen Lung failed. The soda lime stopped removing carbon dioxide. He inhaled poison gas, lost consciousness, and drowned 60 feet below the surface. Another held his breath during the ascent. The expanding air ruptured his lungs. He died only 50 feet from the surface. A third panicked and ripped off his breathing bag. He tried to swim up without it. He never made it. 2 others simply vanished. Their lungs worked. Their equipment was functioning. But they never surfaced. No one knows why. Of the 8 who reached the surface, 3 were too injured to swim. They had survived the ascent. They had reached daylight. But their bodies had nothing left. One by one they slipped beneath the waves and disappeared. 5 men remained from the escaped trunk. 5 out of 13 who attempted the climb. 5 out of 30 who had been alive in the torpedo room. 5 out of 87 sailors aboard USS Tang. Commander Richard O'Kane was already in the water. When the torpedo struck Tang, the explosion had thrown him from the bridge. He had spent 8 hours floating in the Taiwan Strait, swimming, waiting, watching his submarine sink. 3 other bridge crewmen had survived with him. They had seen Tang's stern drop, seen the bow rise briefly into the air, then watched the submarine disappear beneath the sea. When the survivors from the escape trunk began appearing, O'Kane swam toward them. The group gathered together, counting faces, counting survivors. 9 men in total. 9 American submariners floating in the open ocean at dawn. 9 men who had just survived the only combat use of the Momsen Lung in the Second World War. At 8 o'clock, one of them spotted a ship on the horizon. It was heading toward them. Hope surged through the group. They waved, shouted, tried to signal. Rescue was coming. The vessel approached. 500 yards. 300. 200. Close enough to see the flag. It was Japanese. A patrol frigate. And on its deck stood survivors from the ship's Tang had destroyed the night before. Burned men. Wounded men. Men pulled from flaming tankers and shattered transports. Men who knew exactly who had destroyed their convoy. The ship stopped 50 yards away. Cargo nets were lowered into the water. Japanese sailors began hauling the Americans aboard. O'Kane was pulled up first. Then the others. They collapsed on the deck. Exhausted. Hypothermic. Covered in oil. They expected to be taken below as prisoners of war. Expected interrogation. Expected captivity. Expected to survive. Then the merchant sailors saw them. The men whose ship's Tang had destroyed. The men who had watched friends burn alive in the oil-covered sea. Rage exploded across the deck. The beating began instantly. Boots slammed into ribs. Rifle stocks struck heads. Fists hammered into faces. The survivors of the convoy attacked the helpless submariners. They had lost everything. Their ships, their cargo, their comrades. And now the men responsible lay in front of them. O'Kane took the worst of it. The attackers recognized him immediately. The officer, the commander, the man who had ordered the torpedo attacks. They kicked him again and again in the stomach. Struck him across the skull with a rifle butt. Beat him until he collapsed. Bleeding, barely conscious. And yet, despite the rage, despite the hatred, despite the violence, Richard O'Kane and the 8 men beside him were still alive. The only survivors of USS Tang. Eventually, the Japanese naval crew aboard the frigate stepped in and dragged the enraged merchant survivors away from the Americans. But by then the damage had already been done. Richard O'Kane had broken ribs, a fractured skull, and internal injuries. 2 other survivors suffered severe concussions. One man's jaw had been broken. Another had lost several teeth. All 9 Americans were now more badly hurt than they had been when they were first hauled from the water. Their journey into captivity began almost immediately. From the frigate, they were taken to Formosa, then to Hong Kong, then by train toward Taipei, then by ship again to Japan. The trip lasted roughly 10 days. 10 days with almost no medical care. 10 days with almost no clean water. 10 days of stale air, darkness, rice rations, and beatings whenever the guards felt like delivering them. The men were kept in a cargo hold, treated less like prisoners of war than cargo themselves. The Geneva Convention might as well not have existed. On November 4, 1944, the 9 survivors arrived at Ofuna, a secret interrogation center north of Tokyo. Ofuna was not a normal prison camp. The Japanese Navy operated it outside the recognized prisoner-of-war system. The Red Cross did not know it existed. No official notification was sent. No records were kept. Men sent there simply disappeared from the world. That was the point. Ofuna was designed to break prisoners psychologically before they ever reached a regular camp. The routine was deliberate. Solitary confinement. Starvation rations. Endless questioning. Sleep deprivation. Beatings for the smallest infraction. The interrogators wanted intelligence, anything that could help stop the American submarine campaign that was choking Japan's empire. They wanted patrol areas, torpedo performance, radio procedures, command methods, tactical doctrine, anything. O'Kane gave them nothing. Neither did the men who survived with him. Like thousands of trained American prisoners before them, they gave only the standard information. Name, rank, serial number, nothing more. The interrogators tried threats, promises, isolation, violence, and still got almost nowhere. The survivors of Tang had been trained for the possibility of capture. They had imagined this moment long before it came. They understood that if they broke under questioning, they might endanger every submarine still operating in the Pacific. So they held. After roughly 2 months at Ofuna, the 9 survivors were transferred to Amori, a more conventional prisoner-of-war camp near Tokyo. Conditions there were marginally better. There was more food, slightly less torture, and, most importantly, contact with other Allied prisoners. But Amori was still a brutal place. Forced labor, thin clothing, constant hunger, disease. Guards who beat prisoners for sport or boredom. The Tang survivors quickly learned something else as well. The Japanese viewed submariners differently. To many Japanese officers, American submarine crews were not lawful combatants. Since December 1941, U.S. submarines had waged unrestricted war on Japanese merchant shipping, sinking hundreds of cargo vessels and sending thousands of merchant sailors to the bottom. In the Japanese view, submarine officers were not merely enemy sailors. They were pirates, war criminals, men who could be executed if Japan chose to make an example of them. O'Kane and his crew lived beneath that threat every day. Any morning could be the morning the guards decided the Americans had become too valuable as symbols of revenge to be kept alive. Then came winter, December, January, February. The cold inside the camp was merciless. The prisoners had inadequate clothing, thin blankets, and almost no heat. They slept in barracks that might as well have been sheds. Malnutrition hollowed them out. Weak men caught pneumonia. Others developed tuberculosis. Some simply starved too slowly for anyone to notice until they stopped moving. The Tang survivors held on. Barely. Then, in March 1945, the sound of the war changed. The first B-29s began appearing over Japan. From behind the camp fences, the prisoners watched the American bombers cross the sky. They saw the distant columns of smoke rising over Tokyo. At night, the horizon glowed with fire. Liberation suddenly felt possible, but it also felt dangerous. American bombs did not know where the prison camp fences were. A prisoner-of-war camp looked very much like any other cluster of buildings from altitude. The men found themselves trapped between hope and fear. Hope that the bombers meant the war was ending. Fear that an American incendiary would kill them before the Japanese ever surrendered. By the summer of 1945, Tokyo was becoming a ruin. Air raids came again and again. High explosives, incendiaries. Entire districts burned. At Amori, the prisoners could see smoke spreading across the city and hear explosions rolling over the bay. Then, in August, something shifted. On August 6th, the guards suddenly became uneasy. Rumors moved through the camp in fragments. A single bomb had destroyed an entire city. Impossible, the prisoners thought. Then came the name. Hiroshima. 3 days later, another city. Nagasaki. The change in the guards was immediate. Their cruelty did not disappear, but it softened in strange and nervous ways. They stopped forcing some of the harsher work details. Beatings became less frequent. Some guards began preparing to leave. Even without official confirmation, the prisoners could feel it. Japan was losing, and losing fast. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice came over radios across Japan. The surrender announcement. The war was over. For the 9 survivors of Tang, that moment meant something almost impossible to believe. They had survived the sinking of their submarine, survived the freezing waters of the Taiwan Strait. survived beatings on the deck of the Japanese frigate, survived Ofuna, survived starvation and disease in Amori, survived nearly 10 months as prisoners of the empire they had spent the war fighting. They had outlasted Japan itself. American forces reached Amori on August 29th. Navy officers, Marine guards, medical teams. The gates opened. The processing began. And almost immediately, the Tang survivors were identified as priority cases. Submariners had special intelligence value. These men knew firsthand what Japanese interrogation methods looked like, what conditions secret detention centers imposed, and what had happened to one of the most famous submarines in the U.S. Navy. O'Kane weighed only 112 pounds. When Tang was sunk, he had weighed about 170. The others were in similarly ruined condition, thin, weak, sick, and barely able to stand for long. They were evacuated to hospital ships in Tokyo Bay. For the first time in 10 months, they received proper medical treatment, clean beds, and real food. For many of them, even safety felt unfamiliar. The debriefings began almost at once. Naval intelligence wanted everything. What happened to USS Tang? How many men survived the sinking? How had the escape from 180 feet worked? What did the Japanese ask during interrogation? What did they know about American submarines? What did they suspect about the Mark 18 torpedo? O'Kane answered in detail. He described the convoy attack, the torpedo shots, the circular run, the explosion, the loss of the submarine, the Momsen Lung escape, the capture, the prison camps, everything. His account became the only complete explanation for the loss of America's most successful submarine. And what it revealed stunned the submarine force. Tang had not sunk 34 ships after all. The last transport O'Kane thought he had finished had survived. It was later towed to port, repaired, and returned to service. The official record therefore remained 33 ships destroyed. Still the highest total for any American submarine commander. Still one of the greatest records in naval history. But the cost of that final patrol was almost impossible to ignore. 78 men dead. And one of the most decorated and successful submarine captains in the Pacific nearly killed by his own torpedo. The Navy quickly classified much of the truth. It did not want the public learning that American submarines were being sunk by defective American weapons. It did not want enemy intelligence to know the Mark 18's flaw. And it did not want grieving families forced to hear that their sons had died not because the Japanese outmatched them, but because a gyroscope had failed. So the story of Tang's end was buried in restricted files. But O'Kane's conduct could not be hidden. His final patrol had been too remarkable. 13 ships sunk in the last phase of the patrol. 24 torpedoes fired. 22 confirmed hits. A convoy torn apart by one submarine moving with extraordinary aggression and control. The final torpedo had killed Tang. But it did not erase the patrol. And it did not diminish the achievement. In October 1945, the Navy recommended Richard O'Kane for the Medal of Honor. The citation focused on the convoy attacks of October 23rd and 24th, his close-range tactics, his destruction of 13 enemy vessels, and his refusal to surrender under captivity. There was bitter irony in it. The most successful submarine captain in American history. The officer who had sunk more Japanese shipping than any other commander. Now being awarded the nation's highest decoration for the patrol that ended with his submarine on the bottom of the Taiwan Strait, destroyed by its own torpedo. On March 27, 1946, President Harry Truman presented the Medal of Honor to O'Kane at the White House. It was 8 months after his liberation, 18 months after Tang had gone down. The citation said nothing about the circular run, nothing about the Mark 18 defect, nothing about American technology destroying one of America's greatest submarines. Those details remained hidden, but the medal itself was real, and so was the record. After receiving the Medal of Honor, O'Kane returned to active duty. The Navy valued his tactical mind too much to let him disappear into retirement. But it did not place him back in combat command at sea. The scars were too deep. The weight of having lost 78 men. The knowledge that his final firing order had doomed his submarine. All of that lived with him. So the Navy used him elsewhere. He served in shore assignments, training billets, administrative commands. He testified at Japanese war crimes trials. He commanded a submarine division. He attended the Armed Forces Staff College. He later taught at the Submarine School in New London. Step by step, rank by rank, Richard O'Kane rose to Rear Admiral before retiring in 1957. But no matter how high he rose, one fact followed him everywhere. He had gone to sea as the deadliest submarine commander in the Pacific, and he had come back from the bottom of the Taiwan Strait, one of only 9 men to survive USS Tang. Commander Richard O'Kane lived another 37 years after the war. He died in 1994 at the age of 83 from pneumonia, the same illness that had nearly taken his life decades earlier in the prison camp at Aomori. The other 8 survivors of USS Tang scattered across the United States after the war ended. Some stayed in the Navy. Others returned to civilian life. Most of them avoided speaking about what had happened in the Taiwan Strait. The memories were too heavy. The dive from 180 feet. The terrifying ascent with the Momsen Lung. The sight of shipmates disappearing in the water. The beatings on the Japanese frigate. The months of starvation in Ofuna and Aomori. And the knowledge that 78 men had died while they survived. Only one other member of Tang's crew survived the war separately from the 9 men rescued from the sea. A radio man who had been scheduled to sail on Tang's final patrol. Just days before departure, he slammed his thumb in a watertight hatch while loading equipment. The injury looked minor at first, but infection set in quickly. The ship's doctor refused to clear him for sea duty. When Tang sailed for the Taiwan Strait, he remained behind at Midway. That injured thumb saved his life. He became the 10th survivor of Tang, the only man who escaped both the sinking and the prison camps. For the 78 sailors who died, there was no rescue. Most perished instantly when the Mark 18 torpedo detonated against Tang's stern. Others drowned as seawater flooded the rear compartments. A few likely survived the initial explosion, trapped in sealed sections of the submarine, breathing poisoned air in total darkness. They waited for rescue that would never come. One by one, they died at the bottom of the sea. Their names are engraved today on the Submarine Memorial in Pearl Harbor, where the submarine force honors its lost boats each year. USS Tang herself still lies on the ocean floor, approximately 180 feet down in the Taiwan Strait, about 25 miles northwest of Turnabout Island. For decades, the exact coordinates of the wreck were classified. The Navy wanted the site undisturbed. It did not want salvage operations. It did not want investigators searching for evidence of the torpedo malfunction that had destroyed one of its finest submarines. Even today, Tang has never been conclusively located by civilian explorers. The Taiwan Strait is a difficult place to search. Heavy shipping traffic, strong currents, poor underwater visibility, and thousands of square miles of seafloor. Somewhere down there rests a 312-foot submarine, a steel tomb for 78 American sailors. Despite Tang's loss, the Mark 18 torpedo remained in service until the end of the war. The circular run problem was never completely solved. The gyroscope defect still existed, but the weapon's advantages were simply too valuable to abandon. Silent running, no visible wake, higher hit rates. By the end of the war, Mark 18 torpedoes accounted for nearly 30% of all torpedoes fired by American submarines, sinking thousands of tons of Japanese shipping. Tang had not been the only victim. Earlier, USS Tullabee had been lost in March 1944 when one of its own torpedoes circled back. Other submarines reported near disasters. Torpedoes that curved back toward the firing boat. Weapons that passed beneath their own submarine by mere feet. Those crews survived by luck. Tang's crew had none. But the submarine force learned from the disaster. New tactical precautions were introduced. Fire torpedoes from greater range whenever possible. Immediately maneuver away from the firing line. Watch carefully for surface-running torpedoes. Prepare to dive instantly if a weapon begins circling. Improved gyroscopes were installed when available. Yet the fundamental reality remained. The Mark 18 was still worth the risk. War often forces such decisions. After the war, naval historians re-examined Tang's combat record. Early reports credited the submarine with 31 ships sunk. Later reviews dropped the number to 24. But when captured Japanese records were finally compared with American patrol reports, the final confirmed total returned to 33 ships destroyed, totaling 116,454 tons of shipping. First place in number of ships. First place in tonnage. A record that still stands today. No American submarine in any war has exceeded Tang's score. Tang's third patrol, in the Yellow Sea during June 1944, remains the most successful single patrol ever completed by an American submarine. 10 ships destroyed. Nearly 40,000 tons of shipping sunk in one patrol. The aggressive tactics used by O'Kane during that mission became textbook doctrine. Night surface attacks, multiple targets, close-range firing, constant maneuvering. Submarine officers still study those patrol reports today. Tang also gave the submarine force something else. Proof that the Momsen Lung worked. Before October 1944, the device had only been used once in a real emergency. In 1939, when USS Squalus sank during testing, rescuers used a deep-sea rescue chamber to save 33 men. The Momsen Lung had been intended as a last-ditch backup, a desperate escape device. Tang proved it could save lives. 8 sailors reached the surface from 180 feet using nothing more than a rubber breathing bag and a soda lime canister. It remains the only combat use of the Momsen Lung during World War II. The Navy continued issuing the device until 1962, when it was replaced by the simpler Stanky hood, a hood that trapped an air bubble around the head and required less training. But in submarine lore, the Momsen Lung would always be remembered for Tang, the device that saved 8 men and nearly saved 13. USS Tang herself received 4 battle stars for her 5 patrols. She also received 2 Presidential Unit citations, an honor shared by only one other submarine in the war. Her name remains at the top of every list of the most successful submarines ever built. In 1951, the Navy commissioned a new submarine named USS Tang, SS-563. The second Tang served until 1980, carrying the legacy of the original boat. Her crews honored the memory of the 78 men who had died in the Taiwan Strait. They kept the story alive. In 2001, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans opened an exhibit called Final Mission. Visitors step inside a recreated submarine control room. Each person receives the name of a real Tang crew member. As the exhibit progresses, they experience the events of October 24th to 25th, 1944. The convoy attack, the torpedo launch, the explosion, the sinking. By the end, visitors learn whether the crew member whose name they carry survived or died with the submarine. The exhibit has introduced hundreds of thousands of people to Tang's story. After retiring from the Navy, O'Kane wrote 2 books. Clear the Bridge, about his command of Tang, and Wahoo, about his earlier service under the legendary submarine captain Dudley Morton. Both books eventually became required reading at the U.S. Naval Academy. The tactics he used remain part of submarine training today. The 9 survivors of Tang stayed in touch for decades. They held reunions, wrote letters, called each other on anniversaries. They were bound together by an experience few others could understand. What it felt like to escape from 180 feet of water. What it felt like to watch friends drown. What it meant to survive when 78 others did not. By 2014, all 9 survivors had passed away. The last died at the age of 91. Now the story belongs entirely to history. But the men of Tang should never be remembered merely as statistics. They were submariners who served on the most successful boat in the Pacific. Men who sank 33 enemy ships. Men who helped break the supply lines of the Japanese Empire. Men who died doing exactly what they had volunteered to do. USS Tang was more than a submarine. She was a legend. The most aggressive boat in the fleet. The deadliest submarine in the Pacific. Commander Richard O'Kane was more than a captain. He was one of the finest submarine officers the United States ever produced. A commander who proved that careful planning and relentless aggression could destroy an enemy's lifeline at sea. The circular torpedo that killed Tang was a tragedy, but it does not erase what the submarine accomplished. 33 ships sunk, 116,454 tons destroyed, 5 patrols, 8 months of combat, a record that still stands 80 years later.